Okay, just a couple of quick things before we get to your timeline stuff, right? So, just for next time, remember we're doing the wasteland, and your paper one proposal is going to be due, right? There's also a vocabulary quiz to complete by Sunday at midnight, as per usual. Does anybody have any questions about anything that's coming up? There are some things I want to discuss briefly, but I want to deal with these specific questions first. Okay, so I want to remind y'all that you do get extra credit on the paper for going to the Writing Center, right? And I do want to talk briefly about the midterm and some other related stuff because that is also coming, right? So the basic format of the midterm exam is going to be a set of short essay questions, right? You'll be given 3 to choose from. You'll choose one. You will write a roughly 500-word essay answering your chosen question, right? I will give you a set of sample questions next week. The sample questions will refer to course themes, but they won't refer to specific texts. The questions on the exam, though, will ask you to refer to specific texts, right? So be prepared for that. If you are prepared to answer 2 of the exam questions with maybe a couple of different texts, then you should be in pretty good shape. So I will make sure that I get those to you on Monday. If for whatever reason I show up on Monday without them, because I am forgetful and poorly organized, then remind me and I will email them to you that week. The second half of the exam is going to be vocabulary terms. All of them will be drawn from the quizzes that we've already done. There will be 12 of them, and you will choose 8. And it'll be otherwise exactly the same format, right? You tell me what it is, which text it's related to, and who the author of that text is. In order for you to be able to go back and look at the terms, I'll reopen the vocab quizzes. And also, if you happen to miss any vocab quizzes, right, I will reopen them and allow you to take them. So that if you got a little behind on them for whatever reason, you can get caught up. And if you have questions about any of the vocab words that you might have got wrong, right, take them down and come talk to me. Okay, any questions about the exam? We'll do the exam indoors. We'll do that upstairs to reduce distraction. And pardon?
Is it next Wednesday?
Is it that soon?
And I was just asking.
I think it's the week after.
Sometimes it's something from October.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Just got a whole lot of crap this weekend and into next
Yeah.
week.
Well,
So.
I mean, this is the
yeah.
time of the semester when all of the crap, like all the
Yeah.
shit starts to hit the fan, right?
Yep. Not that one.
Yep.
I was just thinking, hopefully not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay, the 6th.
Yeah.
6th.
That is next week.
That's next week.
That is next. Okay, so what I'll do then is I'll get you all the exam questions by tomorrow morning,
Okay.
or the sample exam questions by tomorrow morning, and I'll reopen all the vocab stuff for you. And anything y'all have questions about, just let me know. Okay. Right. Anything else? One thing I do want to say to it, I'm not going to say like don't stress the exam, like don't try, but it's generally been my experience that if you're showing up and you're doing the work and you're taking notes, you do fine, right? The people who do badly on the exam are usually the people who have been slacking off all semester. I wasn't looking at you specifically.
I wasn't like slacking off. I was just, oh,
No, yeah, see. So, if there are no questions about the exam or about the paper, then why don't we get to your timeline stuff? All right, so who wants to go first?
mean, I've had my stuff done, so I kind of like did it last summer. So I got the first one is the Great War.
Okay.
So yeah. So
Okay.
I think we both kind of figured out that.
Yeah.
It started after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. The Central Powers were Austria, Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria, and Ottoman Empire. The Allied powers of the UK, French, Russian Empire. At the time, which was the Soviet Union, basically. And then, that's about it. And then the second one is the Battle of Somme.
Okay.
Which happened in 1960, but 1916.
Yes. 1960 would be rather late for that.
Yes. 1916. It was the first one. It was the first British attack, and it provided inspiration of British poems and poets to utilize poetry as an outlet for their emotions.
Okay.
And then in 1918, the Second Battle of Somme, it was the end of the war. It started votes for women over 30, and then the influenza pandemic killed millions at that same time. And then Robert Graves wrote this in the poem, Fair Reason, I don't know, process work for sealers. As I pronounce that?
Okay.
Okay, so should I have first two?
Okay. Well, we'll spend some time with all this to pull a little more detail out of it as well. So, yeah, go ahead. What was your third one then?
The Russian Revolution, 1917.
Yeah. Direct consequence of the Great War. Yeah.
Right. Which ended the Tsar's rule and a halt to Russian participation in World War I.
Yeah. Good.
Not bad. It's cool.
Yeah.
I mean, gotta go first.
There are certain things that like when you do research on this particular time period, right? That's what's going to come up, right? It's
Things that are important.
yes.
See, things that are important, right?
So let's pull out a little bit more detail here about the Great War. So, Jess, you already outlined for us a bit here what the balance of power was in Europe in 1914. We had these two separate blocks, the Allied and the Central Powers. And the Allied powers initially consisted of
UK,
UK,
France, and Soviet Union.
and the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union didn't exist yet. The Soviet Union was what existed after 1917.
Oh, it did? Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you had the Russian Empire under the Tsar, and then when the Tsar is overthrown, then you get the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR.
Wasn't the history.
Yeah.
It's really neat watching stuff about around this time because you don't see, like, when you're not watching the war stuff, you're watching what's happening and like I watched Downton Abbey.
Yeah.
And you're watching their high society living, but then they're watching all these things going on, and the Tsar fell and all that, and they're like,
but they're,
what happened?
It's you're watching what's happening to people who are at a removed from it, right?
Right, and they're just what are they going to do? Because they believe in the monarchy, and they would push for their monarchy as well, and so they're just like, how do we live?
Think about that, as being very similar to the attitudes in Britain during the French Revolution, right? When conservative British aristocrats in particular are watching, the French depose and then eventually execute their king, right? So I think it's a kind of analogous time period, and I think it is. The way non-combatants and civilians are experiencing the war, I think, is something that we need to think about as well as we are looking at these texts. Interesting point. So these three nations in 1914, they weren't called the Allied powers yet. They were referred to as the Triple Entente. And the group that would become the Central Powers were referred to as the Triple Alliance. Now, what do we notice, by the way, has changed sort of geopolitically here from, say, the early 19th century in terms of relationships between the UK and France. How did these two countries used to feel about each other?
They used to hate each other because they were fighting over land.
Exactly, yeah, they were enormous rivals, right? But now, by 1914, they're allies. And they are allied against...
The Central Powers.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, the Triple Alliance initially, before the war.
Yeah.
So this considered Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And to make matters even more complicated, the monarchs of just about all of these countries are related to each other. In part because Queen Victoria had so many damn children that she married them off into like just about all of the royal families of Europe, right? Which, another interesting historical side note, because Queen Victoria carried the gene for hemophilia, and so did many of her daughters, right? Hemophilia is rarely ever expressed in women, but they carry the gene. This is one of the things...
The Russian son did too, didn't he?
So the son of Tsar Nicholas II, suffered from hemophilia, yeah, because his mother was, I believe, one of Victoria's granddaughters.
I think she was.
Yeah, I know she was. I'm just trying to remember which generation she was related to.
Yeah, but she was Austrian. I don't know. Anyway,
and again, I mean, think of these royals as being a nationality unto themselves, really, rather than actually being genetically connected to the people they rule, or by and large not.
Right.
So yeah, this is who we have in 1914, before the war, allied with each other, right? So these get a little bit reshuffled after that event you were talking about a moment ago in 1914.
That was all.
Yep. In Sarajevo, right, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and his wife are assassinated by a young man by the name of Gavrilo Princip. And Princip is a Serbian nationalist. Serbia at the time is under the thumb of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Princip is already dying of tuberculosis and, decides, may as well just give it all up in, some, grand futile gesture for my country. And so assassinates Franz Ferdinand, is himself arrested and executed. And because Russia sees itself as the big brother of all of the Slavic nations, they're bothered by Austria-Hungary's treatment of Serbia, in particular when Austria-Hungary retaliates against the Serbians by shelling their capital, Belgrade. So Russia jumps in, the UK and France jump in on their side. Germany and Austria-Hungary decide to try to invade France through neutral Belgium. And eventually, Italy changes sides and joins the Allied powers. Then, near the end of the war, the United States joins as well. We didn't participate for very long. And Italy is replaced in the Central Alliance, the Central Powers, by the Ottoman Empire, who are also trying to keep the British and the French out of their sphere of influence. So, basic upshot of the war, right? The basic consequences of all of this. So by the time we get to the end of the war in November of 1918, we have a total of about 30 million dead as a direct consequence of the war. Actually, no, more like 28. That's still a lot of people. It's still a hell of a lot. 20 million military, 8 million civilian. Right, killed either by shelling or by, disease or starvation caused by the war, right? You have the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires. Although the Russian Empire kind of reconstitutes itself as the Soviet Union. But yeah, you have a complete shuffling of the geopolitical map as a result of this, right? You have a communist revolution in Russia. And other similar revolutions in other places. There's the so-called Spanish flu pandemic that begins around the end of the war. And Germany is disarmed and humiliated, leading in 20 years, about another generation, to another world war. So the First World War, in a lot of ways, it changes a lot, but doesn't really resolve anything. And enormous numbers of people are killed or displaced, others psychologically damaged. And I've got a couple of little handouts for you here. These are British recruiting posters. And what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes with these and think about what kinds of strategies are being used to try to recruit soldiers here. And how these might relate to some of the poems we wrote. Can I give you one of these? To some of the poems we wrote. Just take a few minutes, look these over, and when you have something to say, just go ahead and say it. Okay, can you explain how? Yeah, give me an example.
Okay, in their country's fall, isn't this what fighting force now?
Uh-huh. Okay.
It makes you seem like you're a bad person if you don't fight for your own country.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and you're gonna say no to grandma?
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Yeah,
Who's gonna say no to grandma?
Uh-huh.
That's a guilt trip right there.
Okay, so we're already seeing a singular theme developing here, right? Even as there are differences in presentation, right?
There's
And
an appeal to esteem, self-esteem.
Okay.
Because this space is reserved for a fit name. Every man wants to be like, I'm fit, I'm strong,
Uh-huh.
I'm a bad guy, So that's just an appeal right there.
Sure.
Well, I'm good. My
Uh-huh.
brother, if he saw that, he'd be like, yeah, that's me.
yeah, your place is reserved, join the others, right? So this is almost like a peer pressure kind of appeal as well. And I think I think this one speaks to some of the same things you were talking about before. Who's absent, right? Who's not showing up yet? You. But I think there are a couple other things I want to look at. Like let's look at the grandma poster a little bit more closely, right? Or this is actually probably his mother, not his grandmother, right?
Maybe.
But still, right? Go. It's your duty, lad. Join today.
Why don't they put a dash between today?
For instance, that's maybe.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Sometimes they, you know, it was common in like music hall songs that would pop in. So maybe that's, yeah. And it's actually still common in British advertising. So.
No, it's your people that
So yeah, you're going to. Your mom says it's your duty, right?
Yeah, that makes you feel bad for it even more. It makes you feel like, yeah, well, even my mom said I didn't do it. Of course I'm going to do it.
And yeah, it's like part of the idea here as well, right? And I think that connects to this poster here is, you know, what you're fighting for, right? You're fighting to protect mom and your family, right? Look at all, like, what are you fighting to protect in this poster?
He's got like houses and stuff in the old road.
Yeah, like
And he's like literally pointing to a house and he's like, isn't this worth fighting for?
yeah, I mean, this looks like the friggin' Shire, right?
But weren't they called for, or they could? I don't remember. Because then, like I said, I watched Anthem. When the war came about, they were either called up, like you got your drum, or you enlisted.
Yeah, there was conscription. So yeah, you could be called up whether you enlisted or not.
Right.
And yeah, there was also people who didn't enlist voluntarily were often regarded as what were called malingerers, right? Yeah, you know, people who, you know, whose patriotism or courage were suspects because they didn't sign up right away. Now, part of the problem is that because the rate of death was so high and the rate of disease was so high, they ran out of soldiers at the front pretty quickly. So they started running out of, you know, fit people who made the physical requirements actually fairly early. So you had the formation of what became called Bantam units. And Bantam units, in particular, were made up primarily of men who were too short to meet the Army's usual height requirement. So actually one of the poets that you read for today, Isaac Rosenberg, was a member of one of these Bantam units. Rosenberg was only about 5 feet tall. I think you had to be 5'4" under the Army's usual regulations to sign up. And Rosenberg was one who signed up relatively late. First off, I mean, he came from, you know, London's relatively marginalized Jewish minority, so didn't feel the same kind of nationalistic connection that these kinds of ads are appealing to. And he already had a promising career beginning as a painter and as a poet. Problem was, he had to take care of a mother and sister, and needed money to do that, right? So, you know, here was a person whom the Jewish community in his neighborhood had actually invested a lot of money and effort and care into, right? Like, the community had got together to send him to art school and, you know, pay his tuition. And he joins up with one of these Bantam units, goes to France, and dies just before the end of the war. Yeah, he almost survived to the end of the war. I think he was killed the week before the armistice at the age of 27. Yeah.
I know you've seen War Horse.
What's that?
I know you've seen War Horse.
I actually have not, no. I don't watch a lot of movies.
Have you seen War Horse?
I don't know if I've seen War Horse.
What is it?
Mm-hmm. But you know, a story like Rosenberg's, like, it's tragic, right? It's deeply sad, but it's also not that uncommon.
Right.
I mean, you know, this is something that happened to a whole generation of young men, and even those who come back, often come back either badly injured or psychologically damaged, right? So,
Or dying.
what's that?
Or dying.
Or dying, yeah. So the term that was often thrown around to describe the psychological effects of war at the time was shell shock. So you're nodding, Caroline. You're familiar with shell shock?
Yeah, there was a lot. It had a lot to do with a lot of the reaction from the war in documentary.
Yeah.
They had a hospital there too, as well.
Oh, sure.
At the Abbey for the war. It's really cool. That's a good chat. I should watch it.
Okay. So do you know what shell shock is?
Yeah, PTSD.
It's PTSD, exactly, yeah. It's what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. And so, now we recognize what this is and we actually attempt to treat it, right? In 1915, they did not. And so they tended to treat shell shock as a failure of courage or a failure of nerve, right? That if you had shell shock, what that meant was that there was the problem wasn't that you had been exposed to traumatic experiences. It was something wrong with you, that you needed to man up and get over and get back out on the front. So the Siegfried Sassoon piece that I had y'all read. It's the excerpt from Memoirs of an Infantry Officer. On page 152 here. We left Jenkins crouching in a corner where he remained most of the day. His haggard, blinking face haunts my memory. He was an example of the paralyzing effect which such an experience could produce on a nervous system sensitive to noise, for he was a good officer both before and afterwards. I felt no sympathy for him at the time, but I do now. So yeah, this guy Jenkins is suffering from shell shock. And it was often attributed simply to noise. That people couldn't handle the noise. That's, I think, one thing that maybe you note about these poems is how vividly they describe sounds of warfare, right? The Wilford Owen poem in particular, which I want to turn to in a minute, is built almost entirely around sound. The sound of war, and comparing those sounds to, the sounds of like a village church service, right? So, before we go to the Owens, though, let's look at what is probably the most different poem from the others in this grouping here. Let's go to the Rupert Brooke poem on page 139, The Soldier. Can I get one of you to read this out loud for us?
If I should die, take only this to me. There's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be, in that rich earth and richer dust concealed, a dust whom England more shaped made aware, gave once for flowers love her waste to learn. A body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by the sons of home. And think this heart, all evil shed away, will sneeze more mine no less. Give somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sight and sounds through the half of her day, and laughter of the ferns and gentleness, and hearts at peace under an English heaven.
Thank you. So, what kind of picture of war does this give us? A war of soldiering. Does war really even enter into the poem? In what way does war actually enter into the poem?
Just that he has pride for England.
Okay, so yeah, there's nationalist pride here, right? A lot of nationalist pride. Hold on. Look at this. one day when I retire. Yeah, he's clearly proud to be an Englishman, right? And he does acknowledge the possibility of death, right? If I should die, think only this of me, right? But is there any real hint of violence in it?
Not in the poem, but if you understand when the time the poem was made, you understand it was during the Revolution.
Yeah, and actually I think that's probably an important distinction to make here too. When is this poem written?
1913.
Yeah, originally written in 1914, right? So at what point are we in the timeline of the war in 1914? Yeah, we are right at the beginning of it. We haven't got bogged down in all of this yet. And Brooke never actually saw combat action. So, not for good reasons either. He actually died of fever on his way to the front. So, he also ends up being a casualty of the war, but a casualty of disease rather than violence before he ever has to fight. But Brooke was, Rupert Brooke was a celebrity in 1914. He was actually very well known as a poet and as a professor and scholar at the University of Cambridge. He was known partly for being a brilliant classicist and also partly for being very good looking. The poet W.W. Yates, who didn't think much of Brooke's poetry, disparagingly called him the handsomest man in England. I mean, this was the kind of guy who, young English girls in 1912 had pictures of him up on their walls, right? He was a very handsome dude. And he was one of the leaders of a group of poets who called themselves the Georgians. And Georgian poetry took its name from George V, who was the King of England from 1911 to 1936. And these anthologies that these guys put out they're publishing as a group together, spanned for us about a decade, from 1912 to 1922. So this is a group of poets who are presenting themselves as a movement that they are naming after the guy who was at the time the new King of England. And if we think about what the Georgians' common themes were, like what they tend to do in their poetry, it relates very closely to this picture, right? Where this soldier is, asking you to come and help him defend the Shire, right? And the Georgians are all about, on the one hand, simplicity of style. They tend to write in very traditional verse forms. Like this, for example, is a sonnet. They tend to celebrate rural pastoral themes, right? They don't write about the England of cities and industry and commerce. They write about the England of rolling hills and, haunted moors and, fields and shit, right? And there's a deep-seated British nationalism. In fact, British might even be a little bit too broad. Really a deep-seated English nationalism. Pretty much all of the Georgians are English. No Welshmen, no Scots, no Irishmen. They're English nationalists. That shades sometimes into something almost like neo-paganism. Right, where the English landscape becomes something almost kind of worthy of worship itself. And many of these other poets get their start working in this Georgian mode. Right now, Brooke never moves out of it because he dies too early, right? He dies right at the beginning of the war, so his perspective on this never actually changes. But Isaac Rosenberg and Wilford Owens, Siegfried Sassoon, had all also published in some of these Georgian poetry anthologies. So this particular style influences the way they read their war experiences, but they transform it based on what is actually happening to them. So if we look first, let's say, at Wilford Owens' Anthem for Doomed Youth, because I think that's probably the closest analog here to the soldier. First off, can somebody just have a quick look at the end of the poem and tell me when Anthem for Doomed Youth was published? That'll be on page. It'll be top of page 162. Will be the end of that poem.
The Apology of Hope.
Just above it.
Okay, that.
Just the date.
For the date.
Yep.
September, October 1917.
1917. Yeah. So one thing we're going to see here is what a difference 3 years can make, right? So can I get, Jess, you read the other poem, you read the Rupert Brooke for us, right? So Carolyn, can you read Anthem for Doomed Youth for us?
You said 162?
Well, the poem starts at 161.
I'm so confused, sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, alright. Okay. But passing bills for these who die as captives. Only the monstrous anger for the guns, only the stuttering rifles rapid rattle, can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs. The shrill, demented choirs of the wailing shells, the bugles calling for them from sad shires.
Bugles.
Okay. Anyway.
Yeah.
What candles may be held to speed them all, not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes, shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbye. The pallors of girls' brows shall be their pals. Their flowers, the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk are drawing down their blinds.
Okay, thank you. So let's think about this in terms of what we just saw with the soldier, right? What's different here? Is Owens still referencing an English country landscape? I mean, he is, right, but not in quite the same way. He's not using it for the same purpose. So both of these poems are about us. They're both sonnets, right? And they're both about a soldier's death. But in Rupert Brooke, right, wherever that soldier dies, wherever his dust is buried and mingles with the earth, that's England now, right? The soldier carries England with him wherever he goes. Whereas in this case, Owen is bringing us back to England, right? From someplace else, someplace abroad. And what else are we witnessing here that we don't witness in Brooke's poem? What's that?
No prayers, no bells. So
Yeah. What passing bells for these who die as cattle, right? So on the one hand, this is mass death, right? This isn't just one soldier being killed. This is lots of people being killed at once. And I think I need to clean this board before the market lands, so just try to talk through most of the rest of this. And on top of that, right, like it's mass violent. There's, remember there was no hint of real violence in the Brooke poem either, right? This is ugly. And in fact, these things that are supposed to be beautiful, that are supposed to soothe, our feelings over the passing of a loved one. The choirs singing in the church, the knell of the church bell, the prayers we say for the dead. Right here, like they give no relief because they're just the sounds of weapons, right? The sounds of artillery shells screeching and exploding, right? So we get this blasted, war-torn landscape full of noise where these young men are dying. And then we're taken back to home, right? These homes that they're not going to be returning to. Right? The bugles calling for them from sad shires, right? Call for them, but they're not going to come. And this is the story. And again, I just want to talk about this just kind of like a public tragedy in Britain, right? This is the story of a lot of British villages, right? Whole generations of young men died in the war, and a lot of rural places in particular didn't come back. The villages essentially died out. So, the Georgian hopefulness of Brooke's poem, by 1917, seems almost cruel. Though it was still kind of the official position that you would see kind of preached from Anglican pulpits and put up on, recruiting posters and things like that. The idea was you supported the men at the home front by supporting the war, the men on the front. Right? The home front supported the battlefront by putting on a brave face and supporting the war effort. Whereas the soldiers who were actually fighting in the war, many of them were running back and said, this is not sustainable, right? This is not something human beings should be subjected to, and we're not sure what we're fighting for anymore. So there is also a difference here. And how much time we got? 15 minutes. Okay. So there's a difference here between the way officer poets tend to experience the war. So people like Sassoon and Owen, and see, I know the problem isn't that my marker is good, the problem is that the board is just too damn big. This is a new marker. And then poets like Rosenberg, who fought in the ranks, right? Rosenberg was a private. So we've already talked a little bit about ways in which Isaac Rosenberg was a bit of an outsider in English society generally, right? And certainly an outsider as a soldier, as a member of one of these kind of fit-up bantam units. But I think that, Break of Day in the Trenches is probably my favorite poem from this period. And I think a lot of it is because he has this kind of slightly distanced, ironic perspective for much of what he's looking at. So if we turn to page 156, let's just take a minute with this and see if we can suss out what the situation he's describing is and what he's dealing with. The darkness crumbles away. It is the same old druid time as ever. Only a live thing leaps my hand. A queer sardonic rat as I pull the parapet's poppy to stick behind my ear. Droll rat, they would shoot you if they knew your cosmopolitan sympathies. Now you have touched this English land. You will do the same to a German soon, no doubt, if it be your pleasure, to cross the sleeping green between. It seems you inwardly grin as you pass, strong eyes, fine limbs, haughty athletes, less chanced than you for life, bonds to the whims of murder, sprawled in the bowels of the earth, the torn fields of France. What do you see in our eyes at the shrieking iron and flame hurled through still heavens? What quaver, what heart aghast? Poppies whose roots are in man's veins drop and are ever dropping. But mine in my ear is safe, just a little white with the dust. So what do you think of this? What's going on here?
Saying that the rat passes back and forth between the Germans.
Yeah, so do y'all know basically how battles were essentially fought in the First World War? Trenches, yeah. And this is really the only war in which this was done because it doesn't really make a whole hell of a lot of sense, right? You dig a trench, you put up barbed wire, and you wait in that trench, right? Until you are told to go over the top and go forward. And then the people in the opposite trench just shoot you down, yeah.
Yeah, no, so there was just no man's land.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the middle, yeah, no man's land. Because if you go there, you will be shot. And you would lose, dozens of men from a small unit, just trying to make up, just trying to get a few yards of extra ground, right? Where you'd have to dig a new trench, put up more barbed wire, and so on and so forth, right? So a lot of the time that soldiers were spending in the trench was just sitting still waiting for something to happen, right? You knew something was eventually you're going to get that order to go over the top, or somebody was going to start shelling you. But most of the time you were just sitting around waiting for that to come, right? And so Rosenberg is describing one of those moments. And the rat going back and forth, right? What can the rat do that he can't? Right? The rat can leave the trench. The rat can go and do whatever it wants. While these human beings are stuck here waiting to blow the lives out of each other, right? Sorry about that. Where was I? And who is he saying has better odds of survival here?
The rat.
Yeah, the rat does, right? He talks about, him and, the other men in the trench with him, right? Strong eyes, fine limbs, haughty athletes, less chanced than you for life, right? Despite their health and their strength of body, because they are bonds to the whims of murder, right? They're more likely to be doomed than the rat that can pass back and forth as it likes.
Because in the trenches, they had dysentery and lots of diseases passing around.
Yeah.
Because it was just a nasty situation.
Absolutely.
And they couldn't leave there because if they went forward or backwards, they would be shot regardless.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
They were screwed.
That's true. Yeah, if you try to climb out of the trench and run away, you're also going to be shot for desertion. Right? So you can't win. You're stuck, right? And I think one of the ways in which he kind of demonstrates the kind of the weird stillness of his position, right? If we look at the way he describes the coming morning at the beginning of the poem, what does he say in that very first line? Does he say the sun comes up or the rays of sun spread across the land?
The darkness comes away.
Yeah, what's weird about that?
Because the darkness is a good thing, because if you can peek out your head out of the darkness and you have nothing like on you that's like reflecting on you, they can't see you. You won't get shot.
That's true. You're actually more free in the dark than you are.
So the darkness
Like, yeah.
comes away, so the light is out, and your light is not coming to you. If you are
Okay.
shooting,
Okay. Let's think about the idea of the darkness crumbling here, though, as well. Right? Like, what is that? Do we usually think of darkness as something that can crumble? What kinds of things can crumble? What does something have to be in order to crumble?
cookie,
Okay, a cookie crumbles, right? Yeah, a brownie, right? Dirt, right? But he's describing the darkness here like as something solid, right? This solid, tangible thing that surrounds them. And instead of the sun coming up and driving away the darkness simply crumbles away. It just falls apart. And there's morning, woohoo, right? And I think like there's a lot here about land and about earth. He talks about being in the torn fields of France. About sitting in the bowels of the earth. And we might also want to think about all of this in terms of the actual action we see him taking in the poem. What does the speaker in the poem do? What is the only thing he does here? Well, he looks at the rat touches his hand, right? And then what does he do that has nothing to do with the rat? Okay, well, he does it as he looks at the rat.
well, it's not like what you see in your eyes.
What's that?
It's not like what they see in their eyes. but
Uh-huh. This is actually something even just smaller and simpler.
Just put some popcorn.
Yeah, he picks a poppy and sticks it in his ear, right?
I don't know what poppy is.
What's that?
I don't know what poppy is.
Oh, it's a flower. And have you ever eaten like a poppy seed roll? Have you ever eaten a poppy seed roll? Okay, poppy seeds are also they're used to make opium and opium-derived narcotics as well. So yeah, there is this association of the poppy with sleep and with narcotics, right? But I'm not sure that what he's doing with the poppy here has anything directly to do with that, with opium. If we look at the end of the poem, poppies whose roots are in man's veins drop and are ever dropping. But mine in my ear is safe, just a little white with the dust. So what is he reminding us about the fields where these poppies are growing?
There's ash.
Yeah, there's ash, debris, right? I think the ash, the whiteness of the ash, is itself a reminder of death, right? Or the possibility of death. But poppies whose roots are in men's veins. What's going on there?
I would think it would be.
What's that?
I would think opium, but
Okay, yeah, right, because it is often, like morphine is often, and heroin are often injected, right? But I think I think he's thinking of he's describing this more in terms of the poppy's growth, right? And he's imagining these trenches, right? These fields, right, which are carved out with trenches full of people, and even underneath the earth that separates the trenches, right, more people. So these poppies, whose roots are in man's veins, right, these are poppies the poppies are themselves growing out of the bodies of the dead, right? But mine in my ear is safe. Just a little white bit of dust. Right? So his popping, right? He, for the moment, is okay. But that white dust suggests that death can come any moment. Okay, so we're at about time. Do either of you have any questions about any of this stuff? And we can see how this Georgian material, this kind of rural pastoral material, gets translated into the darker stuff that Rosenberg and Owen are doing later on in the war. Okay. Then, if I don't send you those sample exam questions by tomorrow morning, somebody remind me. And I will make absolutely certain to do so. Otherwise, have yourselves a good weekend.